On behalf of the Louisiana Center for the Book in the State Library of Louisiana, thank you for joining us for this virtual 2021 Louisiana Book Festival presentation. This program is telling the truth even when it hurts. Louisiana memoirists share their stories of hope and healing with Maurice Ardoin, Sheryl St. Germain, and David Armand. Eunice, Louisiana native Maurice Ardoin says that a childhood spent working in a roadside motel prepared him well for a career with nonprofit organizations, focusing on everything from education and health care to global migration and family poverty. He is an alumnus of Louisiana State University in Baton Rouge and University of Louisiana at Lafayette. Cooking, writing, reading, painting, and travel keep him amused and excited to be alive. His blog, Parenthetically Speaking, can be found at mauriceardoin.com. He lives in New York City. 2018 Louisiana Writer Award recipient Sheryl St. Germain has published 6 poetry books, 3 essay collections, and co-edited 2 anthologies, for which she has received numerous awards, including 2 National Endowment for the Arts fellowships. Her latest book, 50 Miles, a collection of essays published by Etruscan Press, offers a personal look at the toll that addiction takes on family and country. David Armand is an assistant professor of creative writing at Southeastern Louisiana University. In 2010, he won the George Garrett Fiction Prize for his first novel, The Pugilist's Wife, which was published by Texas Review Press. He has since published 2 more novels, 2 collections of poetry, and a memoir. His 7th book is The Lord's Acre. He's currently working on a collection of essays. Ladies and gentlemen, Maurice Ardoin, Sheryl St. Germain, and David Armand.
Hey everyone, thank you all for joining us virtually. And my name is David Armand, and I'm going to be moderating a panel today on memoir writing. And with me, I have 2 memoirists and writers who I introduce, and then we'll have a discussion. So first of all, Sheryl St. Germain is a native of New Orleans. She served as director of the MFA in creative writing at Chatham University for 14 years. And she is the co-founder and director of the Words Without Walls program. Sheryl has published numerous books of poetry and nonfiction, most recently the essay collection 50 Miles. In 2018, she was named Louisiana Writer of the Year. And our second panelist, Maurice Ardoin, earned a bachelor's in journalism from Louisiana State University and a master's degree in communication from the University of Louisiana. A public relations practitioner, his work has appeared in regional, national, and international media. He divides his time between New York City and Cornwallville, New York, where he does most of his writing. So thank y'all for being here with me virtually. I wish that we could see each other in person, of course, but it's good to see your faces anyway.
It's great to be here.
Yeah, it's really nice. And it's interesting because I'm in Louisiana and both of y'all are from Louisiana, but no longer physically here in the state. And so that'll be interesting. Hopefully that might be a part of our conversation too, is that sort of background. But I think my point in even mentioning that was I was actually reading both of y'all's memoirs to the hum of generators in my neighborhood, because I received your books and then Ida hit, the hurricane hit. And so I was out of state when that happened, thankfully. And when we came back home, it was about a week or so with no power and all that. So it's an experience I'll never forget, is reading both of y'all's stories. In the heat, for one, and then with the generators. That sound is something that always kind of sticks with you. I was here for Katrina, and so it's kind of a almost PTSD sort of thing going on. But anyway, what I thought I would do is ask each one of you, and whoever wants to go first can, is just kind of briefly tell the audience what your memoir is about, just sort of elevator pitch kind of thing. And then what inspired you to write it? What compelled you to sit down and tell your story? So Maurice or Sheryl, whichever one of y'all want to go first, and then I have some other interesting questions for y'all too.
Sheryl, you go.
Okay, all right. So my son died 6 years ago of a heroin overdose, and I wrote a book of poetry sort of about the struggle of living with him and loving him and living with him. And that was immediately after he died. And because immediately after he died, I didn't feel like I knew anything. I felt like all I could do was sort of moan. And but then after a few years, I began thinking about how culpable our culture is for some of what happens to our young people with addiction. And I also started being able to put together stories and narratives. And so I wanted to write something else. So I wrote this collection of lyric essays, and it's called 50 Miles because I've thought a lot about my own use of drugs and alcohol. I'm sober for 13 years. And while I wasn't addicted in the way my son was, I did a lot of experimenting with intravenous drug use and psychedelics and things like that when I was much younger. And I remembered I was in Hammond. Oh God, it's maybe 40 years ago or something. I was an English major, and I was shooting up cocaine with a music student at Southeastern, and we broke up. And I was working at a bar there, Jeff's. I don't know if that's still there, but I had like little bruises on my arms and stuff like that. And people were saying, "You should be careful." And I'm like, "I'm cool. I know what I'm doing," as I imagine my son would later say. But at some point, I realized that I needed to just get out of town and stop. So I drove 50 miles to Baton Rouge and stayed with a friend who knew something about what I was going through. And I never looked back. I never did anything like that again. I started working in a bar in Baton Rouge, and then I commuted to Hammond back and forth. And so my son, the day that he died, he was in Dallas, and he drove 50 miles to a little town where a friend who sold him dope lived, and he died that day. And it was I tell a more elaborate story about it, but to make a long story short, I thought a lot about what he must have thought about on those 50 miles and why. I mean, there's no answer for this, but why I chose life and he chose death, because I think he did in many ways choose death. And so while the essays don't give any answers, I wanted people to think more deeply and lyrically about the issue of addiction. And I also played video games with my son, and video games are, really demonized a lot. And I have a very long essay in here about playing World of Warcraft with him, which was actually a good thing. And so I wanted to bring him alive as someone who was funny and smart and creative, and not, sort of put the memoir against this kind of cliche that we have of addicts. And, the root of the word addiction is lover, it's a lover of something. So while I don't want to promote it, I wanted to offer a different story. So sorry for going on, but that's why I wrote it.
Well, thank you, Sheryl. Thank you. And certain things you were saying, actually, I have questions about it, so we'll get to those later. So I'm interested to hear more about a lot of that. But thank you for telling us that.
Sure.
So, Morris, do you want to tell us about what inspired you to write your story?
I'm going to give a visual of my book. It's probably reading backwards, but that's my book. It's called Stone Motel, Memoirs of a Cajun Boy. I'm the Cajun boy, even though I'm 700 years old. Now I'm no longer a boy. But what inspired me to write this book, the book originally was supposed to be just a collection of short stories. It wasn't fiction. It wasn't nonfiction. I started writing it as fiction, and then I realized this is not really doing what I wanted to do. So I started working on it as a nonfiction, and that's where it got into places where I hadn't planned. And that's, for example, the trauma, the domestic violence, things like that I could not ignore. Some of the harder stories, all the harder stories, I didn't plan to tell those stories. I was planning to tell a collection of short stories about childhood in Louisiana, the Cajuns. There's a lot of material out there on those things, but I felt that my experience as the middle child of 9 children, growing up in a little motel, running a motel, and my parents basically had their own interests. My mother had her own business, and my father was very engaged in all kinds of things, keeping the motel going. But in the summer times, we 9 children, 4 of us, a cohort of 4 of us out of the 9, the middle of the pack, really ran the motel. We did, and we were kids. We were renting rooms. We were cleaning them. We were cutting the grass. We were doing basic repair work with my dad and my older brother, our older brother. And so we did a lot of stuff to make that motel run. And one of the things we did to cope with a lot of that, we didn't realize it was hard work, how hard it was, until we all grew up and had the same comments from peers who said, I had no idea you all were working that. We were going to school, doing multiple things at school, getting very involved. And we just thought that was normal. And that normal piece, understanding, couching things as normal as a kid, your normal is so varied from other people's experiences. But I actually thought everyone kind of did something similar in their own homes, that they all had something to do and had to do it. Everybody calls them chores. So we were paid very nominally for our work. So it wasn't that we were free labor. But I wanted to write the story. What really compelled me to write this is I remember so vividly my grandmother's house, my grandparents in particular, but my grandfather died when I was very young. But I wanted to give my relatives who are here, born way after this time, and who will have children well beyond me when I'm gone. I wanted them to know my grandmother in particular. She was such a strong force in my life. And as I'm telling that story to explain how that was, then I realized, I have to explain out everything else too. So I wrote the hardest parts of this book last. I was enjoying writing everything. I couldn't wait to get up in the morning and write. And I still do that now. I get up early when I'm in a writing jag. I take staycations and I write. I get up early and I write all day. Sometimes I don't realize I haven't eaten because I love writing. I don't understand people who are uncomfortable with writing because it's such a natural phenomenon. And I think all three of us probably would share that as writers. So that's kind of why I did it. I wanted to tell I wanted people to know my grandmother, Hortense, my mama. And I actually thought one day before this book came out that I was going to write a biography of her. But I didn't. I wrote about those summers. The book was originally called, my original title for the book was not Stone Motel, which is a setting, but it was called The Canasta Summers, because that's what we did. In fact, my three siblings and I, the core of us, when we were playing canasta and Monopoly and other games to in between our chores, we look back on those now, we call them our canasta summers still. So that was very personal to me, but the publisher thought they wanted something a little bit more screaming on the shelf that people would walk by and go, oh, Stone Motel, that's so dramatic. Let's go with that. So that's how that became about.
Cool. Well, thank you, Morris. Thanks for sharing that with us. So it's interesting. So I think that's kind of a nice segue into my first question was actually, both of y'all had different approaches to the structure of your books. Sheryl, yours is a collection of essays with some prose poems in it, in more of a maybe fragmented style, I guess, for lack of a better word. And then Morris, yours is more of a traditionally told chronological story. However, which I don't think, I've read a lot of memoirs, and I don't think I've ever seen in a memoir chapters that were told from the point of view of one of the other characters other than you, Morris, the author. So you have a section told from your father's point of view, and I believe your grandmother's point of view. And after reading the story and then reading those first person point of view sections, had such an emotional resonance to me because I felt like I knew the people, and then I was hearing them, but being channeled through your voice, which was. And so a long-winded question, I guess, is what did the subject matter dictate the form, or did you consciously decide? And either one of you guys can answer this question first. Maybe Morris, you can take it first since Sheryl went first last time. But did you know, I guess, that you wanted to write multiple points of view, or did that just sort of happen organically as you were telling the story?
Well, there are two parts of the answer to this question. One of them is I really wanted to get the dialect across, and I wrote those monologues. There are three characters: my mom, my dad. So the elders each have monologues in the book. And for veracity, I just let you all know the monologues come from interviews with these people. I would say as much as 60% of the content in those monologues is verbatim. I stitched it together as a writer. I had to make it flow. I had to make it logical. So there were several conversations represented, and sometimes in one paragraph. But they all come from me as a child. I was a writer, a little reporter. I didn't know it. Ultimately got my degree in journalism. It just ultimately won out. I didn't plan to be a journalist. But anyway, I was doing that as a kid. And so I have audio tapes and lots of notebooks. I had several notebooks I made. So I had a lot of that content. So I didn't think one day I was going to use it this way. But as I started writing this, I went, oh my God, there's so much good stuff here. Get out of the way of it. Let them talk. And when I was channeling my mother for hers, that was the last piece I wrote, was the mother's monologue, which is longer than any of the others. I broke up my grandmother's and my father's into a few short monologues and spread them out. I wanted to I didn't want the reader to be jarringly taken away from the story. So one of the things I consciously did is make them all talk about the same story, so that it had continuity, and that may or may not have worked for some readers, but for me, I thought I'm not going to let them go off in so many different directions. I have a lot more stuff from my meetings with them that's not in the book, but anyway, so that's how I did that. I think a lot of times as a journalist, you have to report first, you have to listen first, and a lot of times you're going to get wildly different opinions about the same incident. Yeah. I found that very, very, very much a fact of getting the truth of my story. Is I thought, well, here's how I remember it. Then I'll call my siblings and say, hey, I remember that time we did X, or we went such and such. And this is all over the book. In so many places, when I went back and fact checked myself, I would go, let me check on that, because I say this was in a field, but maybe it was actually in town somewhere. So little details like that made me crazy, because I wanted to make sure I was as accurate as possible. And because my own notes helped me remember a lot of this as I was writing it. So having written all those notes as a kid, it was pretty easy, but I still had to go back in and do some fresh reporting to stitch things together, like I said.
Yeah, and I'll say, for me as a reader, it worked, and I was delighted to read those sections. And again, like I've said, I've never that I can remember read a memoir that kind of took that leap to one of the other characters speaking. And growing up here my whole life, I've heard that voice, and then just the cadence and the rhythm, and I thought you did a great job capturing that. So that.
Thank you. I originally, I didn't explain this well. I originally wrote all those three in dialect, and went back and forth with the publisher about this. It made it harder, I think, for an outsider to read, and ultimately we err on the side of make it easy for the reader to read. So I took it down a lot. I got rid of a lot of the French, and I got rid of a lot of the transliterations. There's some still in there, but it was a lot more hardcore dialect than it is now when I started it out, because I really wanted to get that across. That's such you all are Louisiana people, such strong accents, no matter, in all the different regions of Louisiana. And I wanted to get mine down. Yeah.
So Sheryl, in your memoir, or your, I call it a memoir. And I mean, I guess, it's a collection of essays, but they're all intertwined, and they're essentially telling, parts of the same story. But obviously you chose a very different approach, and I think I remember reading either in an interview or maybe in your collection that originally you were thinking about writing a sort of a chronological memoir, and then realized that wouldn't really do justice to the story the way that you wanted it to. I think I'm unless I'm misremembering that.
Yeah, but no, I mean, I did think about that, and the thing is, with a story like this, if you're trying to really reflect how it was, there is no one narrative that encapsulates everything. I mean, I know there are some fiction writers who can do that really well, but I'm not a fiction writer. And I couldn't figure out how to make this one narrative that came to an ending, however ambiguous it might be. And there is a kind of fragmentation that goes along with with stories about addiction and recovery. And there was my story, and there was my son's story, and there was how they came together. There was a story of him as a child and being diagnosed with ADHD, and which I still think is, that was that Ritalin was one of the first drugs that he abused, and that issue. And there were some essays, a couple of essays that I had written already before he died, and the Do No Harm one about the ADHD was one of them. And I wanted to have a few pieces in there that I'd written before he died, even though I say this somewhere in there that I knew there was this train going down the tracks. I could see the whistle, I could see it coming, and there was nothing I could do to stop it, So, but there are some pieces before he dies, and then some that I wrote right afterwards, and then a few years afterwards. And I spent my life as a poet, so I have a poetic sensibility. And I don't know, maybe about 15 years ago, I started writing lyric essays, and I fell in love with the lyric essay form. Because, to me, it's sort of like poetry dressed up in old clothes and, really a much more friendly thing. There are some people who would not read a poem, who would read an essay, even though my essays are primarily structured like poems without line breaks. I think I can get more people to read essays in some sense than I can poems. That's not to say I don't write I do still write poetry, but I felt like there were so many stories that I wanted to tell that were, as you say, intertwined, that it made sense to make a collection of linked essays. That's how I think of this, a memoir as a collection of linked essays. And I also wanted moments of real moments of pause, not just the kind of pause that you have between chapters, but something that happens at the end of a piece where you go, you hold your breath for a moment and you have to wait before you go on. And I also wanted that sense of moving between narrative and lyricism, and because that's how life is for me. There's the day-to-day moments where you're getting up and you're doing your crossword puzzle with your husband, and you're watching some kind of British mystery and the mundane thing, and then there's moments when something incredible really happens and you stop and you have to really pay attention to it. So I wanted that, and it felt like the most truthful way, honestly, to write the book. Because if you ask me today, why did my son die, what was my role in it, I don't know. I can tell you 5 different stories, I can give you several different reasons, and at the end of the day, maybe the answer is not really what we're looking for. There's something about meditating on the process, and so it is a highly meditative book, I think. And yeah,
I would agree, and I mean that's to me, and that sort of fragmented form, I think, is very, for stories that deal with traumatic experiences. That's how we process trauma a lot of times, and it's not a very clear, smooth path. It's moments where I think you had one piece in there where you were cooking in the kitchen. It was a short piece, and then like later on there'd be the longer piece with the World of Warcraft and the video games, and but I feel like but even like you were saying, just life in general is kind of like that. You have these mundane moments that can go on for hours where you're watching TV or doing something, and then you have this profound revelation that and so your book kind of mirrors that, I think, in the way the reader experiences the book in that way.
And sometimes I think if you go on with narration, you have hidden something, like that piece you're talking about. It's about cooking puttanesca, and I hear my son's voice, and I'm not a person who necessarily believes that the dead come back and talk to you, but he was right. It was his favorite dish, and I'm smelling the puttanesca, and he's saying, "Mom, Mom," and I'm just ignoring it because he's dead. He can't be saying this, and then he's saying, I'm sorry. And I wind up saying, I hear you in real life. And if I had buried that in a narrative, it would have been lost. Maybe people would remember it, but I wanted it to sort of stand alone. But I should say Morris has a lot of trauma in his book too.
Yeah.
Even though, Morris, you set out to write about your grandmother, your father is a very interesting and powerful and sometimes sympathetic, but also horrifying character. And I thought you handled those moments of trauma with him really well in a way that, I couldn't figure out quite how to do that. And I did find myself, even though your book is told, sort of as a traditional narrative, there were moments where I just almost couldn't read anymore. I had to stop and consider. And
Thank you.
he was so compassionate also in the way that you dealt with him. I was really deeply moved by that. Anyway.
Thank you. You got him. He was two different characters. Very, very different.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I think I've read a lot of memoirs, like I've said, and I can always tell when someone writes a memoir who has sort of an axe to grind, like they're angry at what happened to them as a child, and they're going to write this memoir and just make everybody look terrible. And like as Sheryl was saying about yours, Morris, is there's still the horrible things that you experienced, and I'll always remember that chapter with the electrical cord. And that was the moment in the memoir. Maybe that's when Sheryl's talking about, where I just had to pause. It's difficult, and I grew up with an abusive father also. And I mean, but then I never got the sense that you hated your father or that you were like grinding an axe against him when you're writing, because the last section with you going out to get Popeyes and warming up the biscuits, and like, it's like you sense the love, and it's hard as a person, I know from experience, trying to reconcile those two things, and so I guess maybe to turn that into a question is, I know that it was difficult to do, but how was it for you because you said you love getting up in the morning and writing, and but moments like that I know can't be easy, but you still did.
Yeah, no, that and describing my mother's death were the two hardest pieces to write. My grandmother writing about her was a beautiful experience because it was more organic and more natural. It was surrounded by sadness because she was lonely. But my mother's was a shock, and my father's behavior, writing about one of those, that was just one incident. There were so many of them. There's some I couldn't tell. To this day, I can't. So I saved that for last. I agree. I'm glad you picked that up. I did not write this book because of that. I put that in kind of reluctantly. I thought, oh God, I have to talk about that because things don't connect if I don't. So yeah, it was that chapter, the one in particular about the wire. It's called Our Father, because I needed to get across, I needed to connect my grandfather's contribution to my life and my grandmother's. And that was, when something's happening to you, if you can try and channel, they didn't use these terms, but try and get yourself on the other side of it. Envision yourself going through, be somewhere else. It's going to be horrible if you can try to use, and again, these are terms that are modern terms, creative visualization, whatever, if you can get through something difficult. So my grandfather was a healer, a Cajun traiteur, a healer, a faith healer, whether you believe in that or not. His message to me was, use that prayer to take your mind away from what's really hurting right now. That's how I see that prayer is valuable to people. I'm not a religious person myself, but I get it. I get why people pray. It does transcend. They do get away from the things that are immediate. So writing that piece was one of those things. I actually had to clear my entire brain. It was the only thing I wrote that day. I wrote the whole thing in about, I guess, as fast as I could type it out. It really came out. Yeah. When I gave it its time. The same thing with my mother's monologue. Very painful to write about the fact I never thought I would be able to write about my mother's death ever. I never planned that. And I wrote the very first line of that chapter I was killed in a car crash. Last in that piece, I wrote everything else, and I said, I don't know how to start this damn thing. And I thought, you know what, she would just say it because she was hilarious. You're really trying to channel her, and so let her say it. I did, and she was likened it to it was very, I just wasn't paying attention. So it was so natural. So I thought, oh, wow, if you let whatever your spirit, let it come out. So the writing process for me is not just, I'm not by myself. And I agree with Sheryl. I do not believe in hearing people's voices, but I feel their influence because it's still in you, it's still in all of us, our experiences, like your mother, David. Reading about that, I had the same kind of visceral reaction to some of those things. And oh my goodness, that's such a hard environment. That's such a it was so bleak.
Yeah.
Your story, and I was just like, I'm grateful because I did not have a bleak environment. I had a really actually nurturing environment. We had a lot of things. I was talking to friends in college when many years later, and I said, we were talking about eating habits, whatever, and I said, well, we had meat 3 times a day, and people were like, what? Yeah. Nobody has meat 3 times a day. So we did. It was just, and that was just a privilege I didn't recognize as a privilege. Yeah. So we had a very nice big family and things to do. And a lot of the stuff people saw as difficult were nurturing. It's not nurturing to be abused by your father. What's nurturing is learning about how to do all these weird things. Chores helped us, all of us, and all my siblings had a similar experience as adults.
Yeah, and I think, as part of memoir writing, and I think it's so important because that's how life is it's not always, or most of the time, it's not always terrible. It's not always great either. There's a balance. And as a writer, I think it's important to kind of capture the good and the bad. And I think both of y'all did that. And that kind of is a nice segue into, because, I noticed certain motifs in each of y'all's books. And sometimes I know as a writer that I'm not always conscious of putting those in there. But as a reader, I always notice them, and I like to, when I get to talk to writers, I love to ask about them. And so Sheryl, I think it's kind of a nice segue that when Morris was talking about the power of praying and the power of whether you believe in it or not, just having this place where you can sort of go mentally or emotionally. And one of the things that I wanted to ask you about, Sheryl, is video games, the importance of that. And you were mentioning when you first started talking about your book, video games are demonized a lot of times in our culture as being bad and making kids do violent things or making kids have or be desensitized towards sorts of things. But you paint them in a very positive light as a way that you and your son connected. And one of the hardest, in both of y'all's books, and I don't mean this as a criticism, but I cried several times reading both of y'all's books. And the moment that when I still talk about it, Sheryl, when I was reading yours, is seeing your son's name on the screen saying that he was offline when you were playing the game. And to me, that's such a powerful thing, though, is because this is something that our society often criticizes. And that's a way that you and your son shared so many moments together and connected. And we still know, you can connect with people all around the world playing video games. And so I guess I wanted to ask you, how that sort of played into the story as a whole, this idea of playing games, video games in particular with your son.
Yeah. Well, I also talk about crafting in there. I'm crocheting. Yeah. I'm also now a fiber artist. I'm in my studio right now, and that's another way that helps me with healing. But I still play World of Warcraft. I played it today for about an hour, and my son's name still shows up offline. He's the one who introduced me to this game. And I said, Greg, why would I ever want to play World of Warcraft? I don't like war. I don't like guns. Mom. And then he's explaining all this cool stuff to me. And this is the multi blah, 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 and creating these characters, and they just don't kill. You can craft things and you can do all this stuff. And so it's a fond memory that I have of him teaching me how to play this game. And then we didn't live together I mean, he was an adult. He lived in Dallas, and I lived in Pittsburgh, where I was teaching. So that was one way that we could connect. We could come together and play. And also, there was another game that he liked. I write about a little bit, Diablo, which I do not like, but I had played it just to figure out why he liked it. And there are so many insights you can get into people by watching how they play video games. My stepson plays World of Warcraft too, and we have played together. And although he doesn't talk to me a lot, I watched how kind he was in the game, how he helped people who needed to be helped, and even though it wasn't going to help his character at all. And I watched, and I tell the story in this long essay about a few months before my son died. We were in a dungeon together where you have to, he understood what dungeons were about, was about, but he didn't stay with the group. You need to have 5 people to kill these huge monsters. And he went wandering off by himself. And I could see his life force going down on the side of the screen, and I couldn't do anything about it. I wasn't playing my healer character. So I went over there, and his character was dead. And, just lying there, and we had to wait till the dungeon was over before he could resurrect, as they call it. But, I've thought about that a lot, because the way that he played that game, ignoring the directions, ignoring the fact that you needed to stay in a group, was exactly how he was in real life. Yeah. And the weird thing is also that I was playing that game when his father called me to tell me that he had died. And I usually play a healer character. It's just heal. That's what I really want to do, is heal everybody. And I just left everyone to die. Obviously, I wasn't going to stay and do this. And there's also just ways in which, as he was a child, that we would share things. And we played Civilization, and he knew more than I did, and so he got a chance to explain things to me rather than me always explaining things to him. I think that video games, there are a lot of bad things about video games, don't get me wrong, and I wouldn't want, there's some people who get addicted to them and all of that, but I think that you have to already have a propensity for some kind of addiction to do that. And Gray potentially played them too much. I don't know, but for us, it was a positive thing, as were all the digital things that happened between us, texts and messages. He told me things texting me that he would never say to my face, about thank you for trying to broaden my life, and sending me clips of Roberta Flack's All the Sad Young Men. And I was just sobbing. He said, listen to this song, Mom. And I'm so sorry that for everything that I did. And I don't know if you know that song, the saddest song in the world, about being a young man and realizing that your life is sort of over, And so there, we demonize a lot of this social media and all. I mean, there's a lot that's bad about it, but it was easier for my son to connect with me, and I think with a lot of people. He's basically an introvert in those ways. So it was important to include at least something about that. Yeah. I wanted to go back to something about Morris too, because I wanted to say, when you were talking about this traumatic stuff in your father, one of the things I think is really important about your memoir, and also yours, David, is that, the thing about the Cajun culture, and I'm half Cajun, is a lot of the books that come out, they're just glorifying it. It's just wonderful. It's, happy, and, and no one ever really talks about stuff like the domestic violence or alcoholism, which we have a lot of in my family, or, just plain meanness. And I tell you, my Cajun relatives, some of them are so mean. I sent one of them my first chapbook, and it was a distant aunt, and she mailed it back unread and said that her husband had told her it was a nasty book and she couldn't read it. And,
wow.
So I mean, I think it was refreshing to see some of that, along with like the critique of the macho-ness of that culture too. Yeah. That makes that book really special.
Yeah. Yeah, and that is something, you're right. I think that a lot of the depictions of Cajun culture, especially like in movies and shows, are, yeah, it sort of romanticizes in a way that is not necessarily truthful or accurate. And yeah, Morris, I agree. I mean, I think, and especially that critique of that sort of idea of masculinity. And I wrote about those same things too, because I grew up loving books and loving drawing pictures. And those weren't things that you were supposed to like as a boy, and Morris wrote about that. I hated hunting. My father would drag me along on hunting trips and fishing trips, and I just couldn't make myself like it. And when I was reading Morris's book, I was just like, wow, that's exactly, I felt the exact same way. I didn't like to be in a tent in the freezing cold and waking up at 3 a.m. and trying to act like tough like everybody else and get the gun. And
yeah, it was for me this a point that I excuse me, I'm getting a dry throat. Was that I tried my best. I wanted to be part of them. And Sheryl, you're right. You're right that toxic masculine culture is very much part of, I think, a lot of places in the United States and all over the world, that you can't escape as a child, because these are your caregivers, and you're like, okay, I'm told, this, I got to do this, and I would much rather go because we had a motel. My parents would take 2 different vacations. My mom would take the girls to the beach, Mississippi Gulf Coast or whatnot. And then Dad, our vacation was supposed to be hunting and fishing. It was like, that's not a vacation. I want to go to the beach with the girls, So I was kind of miffed. It's like, so oftentimes I'd say, okay, why can't I go on both? So I got to go to both. So I did go to the beach with my sisters and my mom, and so did my little brother. So we cracked a few old habits, I think, as kids. One of the things I wanted to mention, it's not doesn't come out so much in any of our book about the South and Louisiana, is the inherent racism and other isms that is. I mean, it comes out. We all definitely touch on it. And for me, the big thing is we were conditioned as children that using certain terms that was normal. Again, that word normal, that was the normal. And so how do you have to train yourself as an adult later on? I know I had to get rid of some of those thoughts that were natural to you as a kid. In my book, I mentioned my grandmother. She uses the N word, and she comes back with, that's the only word I know, basically. It's like, oh, and she would say it in French. So she'd kind of soften in her mind. Excuse me. So that's a part, and again, it goes with that toxic masculinity that's so entrenched in our culture that we all experience, and that comes across in all 3 of the books. And Sheryl, I wanted to talk to you. I wanted to mention one of the things that I really loved about your book. Well, you have a lot of great documentation. Your book is almost scholarly in many places. It's really, really thorough. Unlike mine, mine just goes off the deep end. But you really talk about that horrible bit of. It's a quote, and it's in the bagpipe story, where you say something like, "I'm never going to leave you." This overhanging, this cloud. It goes on and says, "You go ahead and sing whatever song you want, whatever melody you like," and because it is so ever present, and that was so true. When I read that, it choked me up, and I was like, it's so true. Even though I'm now many decades away from these experiences, it's still here. It's still here. And so that really resonated with me. And I think one of the things we all have to remember is that we're in charge of every day now. And that's how I got through a lot of my issues. And that thanks to my grandmother. Get to the other side. You're in charge.
Yeah.
Yeah, just the racism issue is I had half my family's Creole and half is Cajun, but they were both racist. And my Cajun grandmother, who I think is I mentioned to you, Morris, in an email that I think your grandmother might have known her because she grew up in Ville Platte.
Probably.
She was deaf and mute, but she and my grandfather had a cat that they called the N word. That was the name of the cat, And then my grandfather's sister who basically raised my father, because she was the only one who could talk, she was very Catholic. I mean, she actually wore a rosary around her neck. And she would go to church every day, but she would talk about the N word across the street, these N's who have moved in across the street. And I remember as a child being so confused. And my father was like this as well. My father and mother would argue about it at the table. And my father would call my mother an N lover, and it was just like, I love these people, but it's hard to love a racist, but you do because they're your family. But it's something that doesn't get talked about a lot. And maybe it's because, Cajun culture was so assaulted for so long, and it almost kind of went away, that, we want to say all the positive things, and we want to talk about all the good things, the music, the food, the joie de vivre, the hunting. And there's I have a dear friend who just died, Greg Gerard, a couple of years ago, who, introduced me to the Chafalaya Basin, and we go out, with him all the time on the basin and crawfish and everything. And I don't want to crawfish, but I don't mind being in the boat while somebody else is doing it, and all that stuff I love. But it also comes with that dark side, and I think acknowledging that dark side is really important. You can still love something and you can still celebrate it. And one way to celebrate it, I think, and honor it, is to say, you know what? Here's this other side too.
Yeah, you're right.
And Sheryl, hearing you talk about that, I remember, I think a while back, I had emailed you because you've been to Southeastern. I know you went here as a student, and I remember years ago, I don't remember how many years ago this was now, but you came for some symposium that we had, and you read an essay, and I think the title of the essay was the N-word, if I remember correctly. I'm not, but it was about your father.
Yeah, it was called Nigger, Notes from a Native Daughter.
Yeah, I remember hearing you read that, and I can still remember vividly, because it was your father's funeral, and there was a man who was very close with your father.
My brother's funeral. Yeah,
it was your brother's funeral,
yeah.
and he was visibly upset in a way that I just remembered how that impacted me, because I grew up hearing that same thing, and I know people my age, and I'm sure that y'all do too, who still perpetuate that racism and say, well, my whole family said it. And it's almost like, well, that's okay to keep doing it because I grew up with it. But at some point you have to make a conscious choice and realize how terrible and wrong it is, and obviously the three of us have done that, but I still live here, and it's
complicated. I talk in that essay about how my sister and I watched my father. He was a night manager of Paradise Bowling Alley on Veterans Highway in Metairie, and this was like the 60s, and he threw a black couple out. He wouldn't let him in. To me, this was horrific. To my sister, it was a sign of heroism. And she has told me, she's racist. She's raising her children racist. She thinks that's a good thing. And she loves everything that my father did. And my father wasn't an evil man. He was a sick man in many ways, but he was funny. And he had, we all have this dark and light, But I was kind of pissed off when I wrote that essay, because I think Iowa Review asked me to write. This was after Katrina, and everybody was paying attention to race, and they asked me to write an essay about race, and I thought, what do I know about race? A white woman. And then I thought, well, I grew up in a culture that was a lot of the good stuff that I remember was from Blacks. The music, the food, the gumbo, a lot of the ingredients for gumbo, the jazz that I loved so much. And yet there was also this horrific side, but it's complicated, Like my mother was the most non-racist person that I know. And I dated a Black man for a while, and she said, he'll always be welcome in my house, Sheryl. I don't know about what your brother will think about it. But then when I told her I was writing a memoir and I wanted to go in the 9th Ward where I was born, she said, oh, that's all Black now, Sheryl. You don't want to go there. So, this is a woman who was raised by racists, who got out of that, but who still, she's lingering things that she says, So it is a little complicated, and it's going to think about people who it's part of the culture.
Yeah, it's a stain. It's going to be, I don't think it'll lessen significantly in our lifetimes. I'm hoping we get there as a culture, but it's going to take us so long. There's so much unlearning or relearning to do in so many places. And it's not just white and black, it's all kinds of racism and other isms. That's, well, we're not there. We're not. Yeah. So, but I like that in each of the books, your two books, you get a sense that your redemption comes from the acknowledgement that the fact that helped you come out of this was awareness, because it's very simple to, like you said, Sheryl, to just beat something up and you're done. And David, you said same thing, to have an agenda. I don't think any of us had an agenda. Having read all these books, I think our agenda was really, mine was organic in that I let it just come out of me, and kind of like the poetic process, Sheryl. You channel all kinds of energy that's not necessarily literal or literary, and you just, that starts informing where you're going to go. Yeah. So I find that was a nice piece of both of your books, that very fact that, this was not, none of this was forced. It wasn't, as a reader, they're both enjoyable, fluid, compelling reads, and for very different reasons, but they both have that at the core. Yeah. So,
and I think too, as someone who's a teacher still, and I know Sheryl, you taught for many years, students who tell me they want to write a memoir, a lot of times I steer them away from doing so if they're too close to the thing that happened, or if they have a very clear agenda. Because a lot of times the agenda will kind of surface later, and I hate to even use the word agenda at that point, but like Morris, in your case, it's preserving this very important culture that maybe 20 years from now will be almost forgotten. And so your book exists forever now. It's published. It will be here as a record of a culture, a very important culture, both good and bad. And then Sheryl, in your case, it preserves your son's legacy forever. Like, he's immortal because of your book. And also the critique of, because, one of the most, and I remember you sent me an anthology with the essay "Do No Harm," and years ago, I think after you'd read my memoir, you'd written a nice endorsement for it. And I remember reading that back then, so in like 2016 or so. And it being a critique of this whole idea of like, let's medicate all the kids who don't fit in this little box. And your son, he would get up, and you were talking about meeting the teacher and how she said, and I can't believe it, but every day he gets up and he runs back like this, and then he runs back to the desk. And instead of trying to nurture a child who has energy or who's creative, who doesn't want to color the page like all the other kids, teachers in that particular, or one of the teachers you were mentioning was a young teacher, and she didn't really have the experience, I guess. Yeah. To sort of use those gifts, because obviously your son was a talented musician and a talented artist and a sensitive, poetic soul. And school systems don't really know how to nurture that. And a lot of times the answer is, well, let's paddle them, which happened to your son, or let's give them Ritalin when they're very young. And
no one ever asked, no doctor, no teacher, does this child come from a family that has issues with addiction and alcoholism? Yeah. Because my father, my two brothers died of it. My sister is an active addict. I had my own struggles. So you don't want to give a child like that, those kinds of drugs. By the way, there's a great novel. I don't know if y'all have read it, Richard Powers' Bewilderment. And it addresses some of these issues. It's just come out. I think it's shortlisted for the Booker, but it's partly about a child who is not unlike my son, and he's trying desperately not to drug the child. And it's heartbreaking because it's a very difficult child. And but there's they finally wound up doing some kind of neural feedback with his mother's neurons. She's dead. It's a little sci-fi, but anyway, it's a really well written book, and it also in fictional terms looks at some of those issues, which I think are still here. Oh
yeah. Well, we have a little bit of time left, and I thought, I mean, I had a page of questions, and I think some of them that y'all have already kind of touched on, because Sheryl, when you first started talking about your book, you're kind of alluding to, your thought of the importance of memoir in the first place is preserving culture, or bringing awareness to certain issues, or things of that nature. And then in Morris's case, the Cajun culture and just the history and just your family. What both of y'all's memoirs do, and I think all good memoirs do, is they take the particular and make it universal, though. So like, I might not have had the same experience as y'all, but I can relate to it, and I've heard from readers the same sort of thing, and that to me is the why art will always be here, is because that's how human beings connect with each other. Whether it's painting a picture, or making a song, or a video game, or whatever it is you're making. So y'all kind of touched on that a little bit, but I think that we have enough time. If y'all want to, you don't have to, but if you wanted to read, if you have it prepared, like a short excerpt from each one of your books. If not, that's okay. But I think it's good for readers to hear the writer's voice. But again, feel free if you're not, if you hadn't planned on doing that, that's okay too. But would you be willing to do that more? So I see Sheryl's kind of flipping through her books. I wonder if maybe, would y'all be okay with sharing a short little excerpt?
Yeah, I have a 5-minute piece. Coincidentally, I had to do a reading for a book club in Massachusetts earlier this month. So I have this on my desktop, coincidentally.
Perfect.
But is that too much time? Do we have 5
I don't
minutes?
think so, because I think Robert said so we've been going for 50 minutes. He said 45 to an hour.
Okay.
And I think we'll be right on the dot at an hour if you read
Well,
for 5 and Sheryl reads for 5 or so. That would be perfect.
Okay, I'll try to keep it to 5. I'm just going to preface this. This is a piece of my grandmother's monologue, and why I liked it, why I like it for reading aloud, is that it does give me a chance to the dialect, and an example of the dialect. It's core French speaking lady. So this is in the end of the book where she's coming to the end of her life. It's mama, which is the Canadian term for grandmother. Long as I can me. That's the English transliteration of how she said it was, long then I can't me. So I'm going to read it. My dog, Kitty. Cassie gave me Kitty. Such a pretty little white dog, just like her dog. Cassie, know how good it is to have a dog with you. I love Cassie's dog and asked her to get me one just like that. So she got me one just like hers. Kitty takes care of me now. Kitty makes me some company. So I talk with him like he wanted a kid. I'm so lonesome, me. He helped me pass the time. I have to keep my doors locked at night, but Kitty bark and bark and bark, even when nobody come to my door. So thank God for Kitty. I'm going to stay in my house as long as I can, me. Long as I can. I wish it could be like when me and Billy Joe first got married and we went to live with your mama and Zanny and all those kids at that motel. We stayed at the little apartment on the back, and it was small, but we stayed there for 3 months one time when Billy Joe was helping Zanny to work outside. Billy Joe was good then. He didn't drink too much at first. He worked with Zanny on the buildings and in the yard, and Zanny was good to him, so gave him something to do and keep him busy. That was good for us both. But that don't last. Billy Joe started to drink again, and that was not good for his work. We come back to Ville Platte, and there's nothing for Billy Joe to do no more, so he drank. It was like that for 10 years, Sean. So I have 10 years with Billy Joe before he got too couillon to be with me. Florence take him to the city hall, and they find him a place to live, not too far from here. I can go visit him, but he can't come here no more. After the city hall put him on his own little place, he got worse off because it wasn't there. I wasn't there all the time to help him. Then when he got that cancer, he was fini. He fight hard for 3 months and then he died, Paul, bet. Even though he not with me no more at that time, on that time. I'm sad when that happened because no matter where he stayed, he was still something in my life. I miss him like I miss Dejan. Thank God for my grandkid. I know my man was a good mama to all y'all's kids. When Cassie was born, I was so happy with her. She was so pretty. Mimi put her in a pretty little dress and made her hair really pretty. Cassie liked that. She liked to look pretty. She always made herself pretty. I know that when she grew up, she's going to be a real belle, that little girl. And she liked that music. So that's such a good thing when a kid likes the music. It helped them make a happy life. Cassie never stopped liking that music. I think, but that's why I'm more close with her than anybody else, because I like that music to me. Now, Andy was a good boy. Andy helped his daddy work around the house and that motel. He liked to hunt with his daddy too. And I think that his daddy liked him the best. That's what I think. But Andy didn't like school him. He's not so good with the school, but he was good with his hands, ma'am. So that's fine. A man who know how to work hard can make a good life for himself. And Gilda and Glenda, they was hard on their mama. They have two babies. To have two babies at the same time, always hollering and fighting, it was hard for her. Eliza would dress them up just alike. They were pretty little girls then. They looked like two little Catins. Catin for an old person means a fast lady with makeup and a short dress. But when you say Catin for a little girl, it means like little fancy dolls, two little fancy dolls. But they were brigands. I'm going to tell you. They make a lot of tracas no matter where they go. And you know, when they grow up, they're still brigands. Poor old mama. Now, brigand for y'all don't know, it means a brigand in English. It's a troublemaker. Anyway, back to the story. When Eliza had little Maurice. When she leave him with me and Papa when she was taking that beauty school. So he got more close with me than with her. All the time he want to come sit in my lap for me to rock him. I can rock him all day and he still want more. I tell myself, that's just little Maurice. He's just like that. He said, Mama, hold me. Shat, baby. I know he was a smart one here, but he always brought a book with him. He liked pictures and wanted to read before anybody else. I felt bad because neither me or Dejan know how to read us. That was hard for me. I wanted to read with him, Shat, but I couldn't. Now, Dickie was a good boy too. Him and Morris had liked to come pass a big week with me and Dejan. Dickie was never brigand like Gilda and Glenda. Dickie was always sweet. He had some trouble in school because he was too sweet to ask for help. Everything was go too fast for him. He don't know what to do, so he keep quiet. I worry about him now. It's okay to be sweet when you're little, but when you grow up, you have to be more hard. I don't know if he can be like that. Oh, bed. I'll stop right there.
Well, thank you, Morris. So before I ask Sheryl to read you, are you recording an audiobook version?
There is an audiobook, so I get to read all.
Oh, great,
yeah, I did that during the pandemic. I recorded.
Great.
Yeah.
Great. Well, that's good. That's good. I think it's so important to hear that voice, and because I mean, for me, I've heard the voice growing up a lot, so I know what it sounds like and the rhythms. But you have readers in other parts of the country, and you're in New York, so I'm sure maybe readers in New York might not be able to catch it as readily as actually hearing you do it. So that was really nice.
Thank you.
So Sheryl, you have something?
Yeah, it's just like, I think 3 minutes. This is the visitations piece that I mentioned earlier. But I wanted to say one thing, David, you mentioned your students and memoir. And a lot of times we say to students, to wait to write about something because they got to get a distance on it. I think it's the opposite. You wait so that you become more intimate with it. Yeah. Because if something happens right away, you're lost inside of it, So that I just wanted to say that. All right, so this is called Visitations. 1. As a dream, you enter me, zombie-like, your eyes gone. We cannot talk, I say. You're dead. I wake, sick. This is not what I wanted. Just another version of the nightmares I've had for years of you lost, stolen, flattened, stabbed, beheaded, gone. 2. I'm making puttanesca for the first time since you died. The scent of garlic and anchovies simmering in olive oil barely registers. The tomatoes, the crushed peppers, the sauce bubbling away, a sauce we both loved. It's the one dish whose recipe you asked for, the one you taught your girlfriend to cook. He was always so worried about the garlic, she said, at your service, that he'd saute it too long and it would brown and taste funny. I cut up black olives, chopped parsley, grate cheese, spoon out a heap of capers to add to the sauce. The pasta water is boiling. I'm thinking of nothing but the next step in the construction of the dish, But as I stir the sauce and the aroma envelops me more intensely, I feel something like you for the first time since you died. It's like you're physically right next to me. I'm not expecting it, so at first I don't pay close attention. Mom, you say, I'm sorry. I pour the penne into the boiling water. I'm sorry, you say again, though it's less a saying than a breath of something that's entering the edge of my consciousness. I ignore you because you can't be speaking. You're dead. I give the pasta a quick stir before turning down the heat. Again, more insistent. I'm sorry, sorry. I'm stirring the pasta, but starting to feel your presence. Now you're pushing yourself into me. Notice me, you seem to be saying, but it's hard to concentrate on noticing something I don't know how to acknowledge. I'm still too full of your death to hear, too focused on the food I'm cooking. Yes, it's a recipe you loved, but I also remember you vomiting it up during the night once, me having to clean it up, your t-shirt, the bed sheets, your shoes, the carpet. I'm remembering how years later you told me you'd searched the house for alcohol that night, drank everything you found after I'd gone to bed. You must have been 18. I love you. I miss you, but I am so angry with you. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. The presence, the ghost, the thing that is you and not you says and does not say. So pressing, so urgent. I have to say, finally, despite myself, out loud to the putinetta nesca-scented air. I hear you.
Thank you, Sheryl. And that's, that was one of the pieces that I think I mentioned way earlier in our talk, is one that is one of those moments. It's a brief piece, but it sort of works to kind of establish that tone that you have, or that pattern throughout the whole book, in some of the pieces even read just like poems, not even prose poems, but with line breaks and everything. And
yeah, there are some pieces in here that consider poems. Yeah.
And I think that, just to get back on the idea about waiting, I think I agree with you. I think sometimes we wait to not get distance necessarily, but to have a better understanding. But it probably should qualify that sometimes waiting for someone could be 6 months or a year, not 10 years, as because people like me, or I've been told, this just happened with your mother 2 years ago. You have to wait like another 10 before you, but we forget things, and we forget those visceral feelings.
Yeah.
And so sometimes it's important to write it very soon.
I think it's important to journal. I've had journals for like 50 years, and you just write it in the journal, but don't publish it right away.
Yeah.
And especially when you were talking earlier about anger, just being angry at someone. And, I have both love and anger for my father and my mother who just died, and my son. And it's too early to write about my mother, but I want to get to a place where I can write honestly and truly about her, what I loved about her and what was really abusive about her. And I can't do that right now, because as soon as I start writing about the abusive stuff, I'm going to be pissed off and angry. And, you need to just, and when you're ready, I think you can tell when you're being fair, when you're being compassionate,
Yeah, and I think of a memoir, one of my favorite, and I think, as a kid, I encountered the movie first, but This Boy's Life by Tobias.
I love that book, yeah.
So I came out when I was pretty young, so I saw the movie, and then when I became a more serious reader, I read the book. And I remember the epigraph. He said, this book is dedicated to my stepfather, who said that everything I didn't know could fill a book. Well, here it is. And it's kind of like a big F you to the guy. But as he wrote the book, it wasn't like he was mad at him the whole time. It was still like he was trying to figure out like this conflicted man who was just so abusive and horrible. So there always has to be that balance. And I think both of y'all do that.
I think the writing process, we all do it. And I do agree with you, Sheryl, journaling, keep writing. And for me, this is a big old book group, Louisiana Book Festival. I think one of the things I try to hit home is that the writing process is so personal and so necessary for those of us who do it. I would like to start a campaign to get teachers out there to stop giving writing as punishment work to kids, because that association is what I think drives a lot of people to just they shrivel up with the idea of having to write. And we like to write every day. That journaling idea is like that. That's why I have my content, is because I wrote something down. I practically write something every day. If not, then I have days where I write a lot of it that pile up. But it's a natural process for me. It's like eating and breathing. And I want more kids out there to be more comfortable with the concept of writing, being a writer. There's a lot more stories to tell that are not being told. So,
yeah, I agree. Well, I could talk to y'all probably for another 3 hours easily. I wish that we had more time, but so we a little over an hour. I think that's okay. But thank y'all so much for coming.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And the book festival, I'm quite pleased. I'm honored to be part of it.
Yeah, and good luck with y'all's books. I know they both came out. I had a book come out last year too, and I'm not even doing this for my book, so I haven't done anything for it. But I mean, I'm always grateful just to have something out there. But that's a tough year to publish a book. But at least we have opportunities like this to talk about our books and writing and the stuff we love. And so thank y'all for being a part of it. Thank you, Robert and Jim Davis. I know he's not on here, but if he sees it, thank you, Jim, and everybody put all this together.
Yeah.
Thank you for watching this presentation of the virtual 2021 Louisiana Book Festival. Please visit our official bookseller, Cavalier House Books, and receive 20% off all featured festival titles through the end of the year. A special thank you to our festival sponsors. The Louisiana Book Festival will return on October 29th, 2022.